What if I told you you don't have to sit alone in grief anymore? This is Natasha Smith, and you are listening to the Can You Just Sit With Me podcast. When we are faced with the loss of something or someone we love, we simply need space and grace to grieve. So I'm so excited to sit with Leanne Friesen today. She is an ordained minister and the author of the new book, Grieving Room, Making Space for All the Hard Things After Life and Death. And as always, I can't wait for you to listen to this episode. So pull up a chair, take a seat, and join the conversation. So I'm so excited to be sitting with Leanne today. I just want to go ahead and get started and ask you the question. Can you tell us about a time when you wanted to ask someone this question? Can you just sit with me?
I can think of so many times, honestly, Natasha, that came up with me, but there was one that really stood out. I mention it briefly in my book that I'm sure we'll reference, Grieving Room. A number of years ago, as I talk about my book, I had my older sister, Roxanne, passed away after an 8-year battle with melanoma. She lived a few provinces away from me. I'm in Canada, and I'd been down in the days before her death. So I had been away, had sat with her. She died, and then had been there a week or so for her funeral and another few days helping deal with things and so on. And I had just gotten back to Ontario where I'd been gone for, 2.5 weeks or so, and really had lived through a significant trauma, right? I'd been through this incredible, huge thing. I was 35 years old, not something most of my friends had lived through. And one of my friends called and said, "Do you want to go for a walk?" Two of my girlfriends, my two really close friends. And they said, "Can we go for a walk?" And I said, "Yeah." And we went out, and I remember just thinking, I just want to talk about what happened. And I really wanted to share and debrief the experience of sitting with her when she died. I hadn't really had a chance to say, this is what happened. This is what it was like. This is what it went through. And we went out the door and we just started walking. And I was having some trouble talking. My friends were like, "How are you?" And I said, "I'm okay." And it was just sort of awkward for a bit. And then my one friend said, "Do you want a distraction?" And I
Mm.
kind of didn't know what to say. And then she spent half an hour telling me about the new guy she was dating. And I remember just being a bit stunned. We've talked about it since and we've moved on and all those things. And I remember the whole time thinking that some version of that, can you just sit with me? Like, I don't need to distract me. I need a little bit more time to be willing to talk and able to talk and find my words. And I remember going to my house and saying to my husband, "I'm broken," because I didn't know how to interrupt. I'm usually pretty good at interrupting. Any of my friends listening now will laugh. And but I didn't know how to sort of ask for what I needed or say what I
Mm.
needed. And I just thought, wow, there's something wrong with me. But my
Mm.
grief was so heavy. And that's one time that came to my mind. And as I was grieving, there would have been so many more like that. And again, it wasn't often that people weren't willing. Sometimes it
Yeah.
was that I didn't know how to ask. And that's really what I needed was, can we just sit together? Can we just be, even if I don't quite know what to say yet or how to say it?
Hmm. Such a great story to kind of illustrate that. And I love how you said, you didn't have the words or didn't really know how to
Mhm.
kind of articulate like that's what you needed during that time frame. And so can you just tell us a little bit about your story? You mentioned your sister Roxanne. Just tell us your story and tell us how it informs your work, your new book, Grieving Room.
Absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity. So I grew up the youngest of four children, and I had two older sisters and an older brother, Roxanne, Deanne, Jason, and Leanne. So people love to comment on that. Roxanne, Deanne, and Leanne. That was the thing growing up. And in 2005, my sister Roxanne was diagnosed with melanoma, late stage melanoma. It hadn't been found for a long time. And over the next 8 years, she went through so many different treatments, surgeries, and ultimately in 2013, it took her life. As I said, I was 35 at the time. And for me, this was a profoundly jarring experience. And what was maybe somewhat unique to my experience is that I would have felt very much like I had a bit of a head start with grief because I am actually a pastor. And so I had been all through that time, I'd been serving pastoring a church, and I have a number of uh, specific training experiences in grief support. I knew grief, I'd read a lot about it. And even though I had training as a pastor, I even went beyond that. I'd done extra courses. It was a topic I was really interested in. So, all through those years, I had been conducting funerals, I had been doing grief support with people, grief counseling, journeying with people who are grieving, sitting with the dying. And so there was a sense with me that, well, I have some understanding of this. But when my sister died, I was shocked by a number of things. I was shocked that even though she'd been sick so long and I thought I was very prepared for her death, that the grief after she died still hit me really, really hard, which many people who lose someone after an illness often say, or they think, well, I was ready, or I had time to get ready, and it can surprise them. And then I was surprised that grief was so much more complicated and difficult and heavy than I understood until I lived it myself. I really didn't get just what it was like to journey in this absolute ocean of loss. And so I spent a while figuring out what it meant for me to have grieving room, a term that I eventually came to start using. I tried to do everything to fix myself. I was going to be a really good griever. I was going to read all the books. I was going to do all the stuff, all the things that would just, make it better. And it took me a while to figure out I just needed space for my grief to be. I started talking about that more, naming that more, doing speaking events, retreats, things like that, where I talk about this idea of giving space for grief. And then eventually I came up with this term grieving room as a description of that space that was needed. I started an Instagram page called Grieving Room with no other intention than I just wanted to support grievers, would just share short thoughts about grief support. And at the same time, I was writing this book, Grieving Room, and that came out just in February. So my life ended up on this trajectory of grief. Sometimes I still have a full-time job. So sometimes I joke that grief is my weird hobby. And other people who do grief work laugh with me and they go, me too, actually, because it's something I do as a sense of call and purpose and to help others. And I hope the book will keep doing that.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I love the term grieving room. And we'll get into it a little bit. I don't want to get ahead of my questions. And so in the book, you mention a story where you're in conversation with, I believe, a few friends at church, or maybe just some people passing in church. And you mentioned something and someone says 3 words. They say, "Don't say that."
Yes. This is an introduction to the book. And a number of people comment on this. And so I actually don't remember who said it to me, but you're right. It was at church on a Sunday morning. My sister was dying. She died just a few weeks before that. And to paint the picture of what those weeks have been like, again, I had just returned from a visit home with her where she was in bed full time, losing her appetite, slowly due to the pain medications, getting less and less coherent. But we were doing things like going through her photo albums to pick out pictures for her funeral. I had gone through her closet with her to talk about what she was going to wear in her casket. She was dying. And so when I was talking to this person, and I do not remember who it was, which is really strange because I actually have a bizarre memory for these kind of details. But I think it's just been removed from me for really good reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And the person said, "How's your sister?" which was so lovely. And I said, "Well, she's dying," planning to finish the sentence. And they said, "Oh, don't say that." Mm-hmm. And of course, they meant it with good intentions. And I said, "Well, what do you want me to say?" And they continued to say, "Well, you have to have hope. You can't give up." All these things we say to people. And I was so taken aback. Now, the funny thing is, since this book has come out, can I tell you, Natasha, it's actually starting to get funny how many people have called and apologized for fear that they are that person. And they said, "I'm so sorry if that was me, because I think it might have been me." And I've said, first of all, I have absolutely no memory of who it was, but I remember that it was not you, because I remember it was someone I didn't know very well. And the people who said have known me well. And I said, and secondly, even if it was you, God has used that story in such,
Yeah.
it has been redeemed, and it is okay, because I've been able to use that to make such an important point of what grievers go through. And again, this person wasn't being unkind. They were
Yeah.
not. They were not trying to belittle me. It's how everyone responds. It's what our culture does. Our culture goes, don't talk about death, don't talk about grief. They want us to get to the place where we'll feel better, where everything will make sense to us. And so that was sort of my initial, shall I say, orientation
Yeah.
to what grievers go through, or sometimes what chronically ill people go through, what
Yes.
dying people go through, or people who are suffering, dealing with mental health, things that just can't be explained away or can't be fixed by just saying, oh, don't focus on it, or don't say it like that, or think positive. And I realized, oh, this is our norm, right? That we're not supposed to say it. We can't just say it. What I needed in that moment would be another good version of, can you just sit with me? Really, I think about what would I have most needed to hear. And of course, everyone was different. But it would have been, that sounds really hard. What's
Yeah.
that like for you? I was going through this thing that I didn't even know how to begin to process, watching my beautiful, beloved sister slowly die. And I needed to be able to talk about it. And I needed people to hear what I was going through. And they didn't know how to do that in the way I needed, but I didn't know how to ask for it either. So it was two parts of the coin, I know. So I think a
Yeah.
lot of people resonate with that story and they go, yes, right? There's so many versions of it. Like when people say, I'm not going to do any more treatments. No, don't give up.
Yeah.
Right. I'm going to say my goodbyes. No, 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 don't give in. Or someone says grief is really hard. Focus on the positive. They wouldn't want you to be sad. There's all different versions of it.
Mhm.
Hear it all the time.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's to me, it's kind of well, can you tell us what implications, again, those three words, and you kind of explained that already,
Yeah.
what it can mean to the griever as it relates to giving,
Yes.
allowing grieving room.
Well, again, let me just say, no one does these things to be mean on purpose.
Right.
And so I've said versions of those things.
Yeah.
I
Same.
still do sometimes when I'm not
Mhm.
thinking, because we're so eager to make someone feel better and we're so eager to help. So please be easy on yourself if you're hearing this and going, oh, I've done that. Oh, I'm the worst. But let's just stop and think about what's underneath it. What's underneath it is, don't say that. It's, you need to not focus on that. It's, you need to feel a different way than you're feeling. And it implies that how you're feeling is wrong or bad or uncomfortable or something that you shouldn't talk about. So if you take it from someone who's grieving and you say some version of, don't say that, don't focus on that, don't dwell on that, think positive, they don't want you to be sad, all those examples I've already given, you're basically saying the person is hearing either one, I guess I shouldn't feel this way. And of course they feel however they feel, or they're hearing, I guess I can't talk about it. Right.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
and maybe a mixture of both. So either they're going to say, I just shouldn't feel this way at all. Or if I feel this way, I better not say it out loud and I better not talk about it, which can be really, really isolating.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that because I want to, it's a lot about awareness.
Yeah,
We're not aware
that's right.
because as we're talking, how our culture, we don't often just talk about these things, and so we do. Even myself as a griever, I've said that, and I'm like, oh my gosh, just
Yes,
becoming
I do
aware,
it
like,
too. I do it
yeah,
too. And so we need to be forgiving of ourselves because we're never
yeah,
going to get it all right. And what one person needs, someone else might actually find very comforting too.
that's
But
true.
I say in general, if you're responding with anything that's implying for them to stop feeling what they're feeling,
Yeah,
that's what we can avoid. So that's a good little go-to thing. that if you're going to say something that's suggesting don't feel how you feel or act how you're acting, that can be really invalidating. So things like you're still young, you can have more kids. Well, the implication is don't be sad about the child you lost or miscarried. Or you can find a new partner. Don't be sad about the husband or the wife that you lost. You can, all those pieces, the things are anything that's kind of couched in a don't focus on what you're doing or what you're feeling, or don't be sad, or don't be overwhelmed, or again, don't dwell, or don't let it weigh you down, are all different versions of change how you're feeling. So I think if we can avoid the things that say change how you're feeling, that
Mhm.
goes a long way to help grievers. But our journey is to realize, oh, I don't need to change how a griever feels, because it makes sense that we want to make them feel better. So we see
Yeah,
someone
okay.
who's sad. What happens when we see someone sad? We want to make them feel better. Why
Yeah,
did my friend say, do you want a distraction? She wanted
yeah,
to make me feel better, right? It wasn't meant to dismiss me. It was, she's not talking much. She seems a little bit out of sorts. Maybe if we just talk about something else, it'll take her mind off it for a few minutes, right?
yeah.
And that was done not with bad intentions. And so as we remember that actually with a griever, as uncomfortable as it is for us, they don't need us to take away the feelings that come with their grief. They might
Mhm.
need us to help us process them, make space for them, understand them, but they don't need us to take them away, because we can't just find a magic sentence to take away all the sadness, anger, disappointment, hurt, loss that comes with grief.
Yes. So true. Mhm. So I wanted to, so I have a few more things,
Absolutely.
along the lines of like the title of the book. But as you were talking, and even before, so you had mentioned, about your sister and just not having, um, your peers at that time, kind of understand because they hadn't experienced that. So
Wow.
I lost two of my older sisters and kind of experienced that
Oh,
same similar, um, scenario, I
yeah.
guess, with,
Yeah.
I lost my older sister my sophomore year in college. So I was like a late teen. And then I lost my
Mm,
next to older sister when I was 32 and she was 42. And so I want, if we can sit there just for a little bit, and for you to kind of, I would just love for you to tell our listeners, like, how did you walk through that
yeah.
from a
It
standpoint of giving yourself, like kind of realizing, like, I need to give myself this grieving room. And like, how did you personally walk through that? And then we'll kind of go from there and how you walk others through that as well.
if you had asked me this, that first year of loss, I would have said I walked through it very badly.
Yeah.
In hindsight, I didn't. I walked through it like a perfectly normal grieving person.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
I walked through it with absolute despair some days, with a sense that I would never, ever feel any sense of hope again, that my life would never have beauty again, that I would forever be in the midst of this huge cloud. And the weight of that felt very difficult. And so initially, I did what a lot of grievers do. And I bet you had this experience too, Natasha. I remember going through the phase, I call it the grief apology,
Oh,
where I reached out to the one or two friends who had had a similar loss. One friend who'd had a sister die suddenly a few years before, and said, I'm so sorry. I did not know what you went through. I bet you had that too. I bet you're getting that now as people are starting to lose people in their lives, because
yeah.
people don't know it until they go through it. And I was asking her, how'd you get through it? Am I ever going to feel better? So initially, a lot of my journey was talking to people who'd had grief, and the people that I found that I could trust. So for me, it was a bit of a journey to figure out the people who felt safe for me. And everyone has different personalities. I wasn't someone who found it easy to open up. I was used to being the person at the front in control, sharing, preaching, teaching, with everything laid out just so, helping others.
Mhm.
Very comfortable with others' pain,
Yeah.
but not comfortable, but able to sit with it, not taking any joy in that, but willing to be in hard things, but my own so much less. So I had to start practicing, even
Mhm.
saying, I am having a hard day. I am finding this really hard, and learning the people I could say that with. And I even started to learn to say things like, I find it really hard to cry in front of people or to be vulnerable. So I'm being vulnerable right now. I realized that I would sometimes say things, but I would say them very matter of factly. So it was hard for people to pick up the clues. So I had to even start learning to name that. I'm being vulnerable right now, even if it doesn't sound like it. I'm having a really hard time with this, and it wouldn't necessarily be me falling apart, but this was
Yeah.
actually really hard for me to do. So some of our grief journey is learning about ourselves.
Mhm.
And so I had to learn about myself. I am very poor at talking about my feelings, and I am poor at asking for help. And I struggle to be vulnerable with
Mhm.
people. And a lot of my journey was learning how to make space for that, which for me
Mhm.
involved finding a grief counselor that I could really trust, because it was hard to do that with others. And then eventually learning to say things, even if I didn't quite know how they would land or how it would impact me as I was saying it. It was challenging because, again, I felt very alone in that type of grief, with people who hadn't really carried it yet. Um, And I had to learn that was okay, that people didn't understand, and I couldn't hold that against them. What did you find it like as you were trying to live in this world? I mean, I think especially sophomore year of college, no one must have known what to do with you at all.
Yeah, it was totally non-existent.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that's part of my story. Like I kind of sat with the grief for years and
Yeah.
literally decades, really. And it's only been the last 4 years since 2020 that I started to process all these things. And
Mhm.
so it's super, super challenging. And so as I'm listening to you, I'm like, yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah,
Well,
because it's like discovering, learning, discovering, and really wish that I which I have to give myself some grace for, but
please do.
wish I would have reached out to at least like a counselor at that time, but I just didn't know what to do and how to do it because of my culture and my background and how I grew up.
Yeah.
And so yeah,
But nobody knows.
it's
Like,
true.
how could you know? None of us
It's
know.
right.
And you had so many other factors adding to so I mean, I wanna say doing it now is not too late. Can we remind
It's
all your
yeah.
listeners,
Oh,
it's not too late, right? That
yeah.
maybe it is 2 decades later. I'm sorry if I'm taking a stab at the time frame there, but
Oh
that
no.
you're processing it. That's okay. That's normal. And I think one of the frustrating things about grief that I say to grievers, and it's kinda like, ugh, is we actually have to help others learn how to help us. And I'm like, I know it stinks that you have to do a little bit of grief education when you're the griever,
Yeah.
but actually for those closest to us, we'll find us doing that. We'll find us saying things like, that statement doesn't really help, or that's not what I need. And I wish we had more grief education. And so I think we need to be doing that culturally, like how wonderful. And I try to do that with younger people. I try to do that with
Yeah.
my kids. So things like, I bring my teenagers, if someone dies at our church, to the funeral, and I explain to them why we go to funerals,
Mm.
why we go to visitations. If I'm making food, why I'm making food for someone whose family has died. This is what we do for each other when someone has died. And we need to be teaching that to people young. How wonderful would it have been if the parents of your friends had said, here's some things you should be doing to help Natasha. You're going to
Mm.
think that you shouldn't bring it up because it's going to make her sad. You should bring it up. You should ask her about it. You should
Mm.
follow her lead. And you're going to think she's over it really in a month or two. And she's not going to be over it. And you're going to find she looks different than she did. You're going to find, oh, maybe she's a bit of a bummer to be around, or she's acting differently, or she's not there for me in the way I once wanted her to be. You need to give her some time because she's grieving. So how can we help each other understand that? And
Mm.
even parents to children, which
Yeah.
we avoid. And unfortunately, we have such a tendency to want to avoid that with teenagers, with young adults, with young people, again, with good intentions, that we sometimes then inadvertently miss that opportunity to help them learn how to be there for other people in their grief.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can help with that a little more. And I think young people can handle it more than we think. I think
Absolutely.
I told this story recently, but I remember being 27 and doing one of my first funerals. So I'm 27, I'm not very old. And it was for a 25-year-old who had drowned tragically. So it was a terrible, terrible funeral. And this woman walked in and she was just in puddles. And she said, they're family friends. My daughter grew up with him. And she's devastated. She's so sad. She's so sad. And I said, oh, where is she? And she said, oh, she couldn't come I told her not to come to the funeral. She's too young for this.
Mm.
And why I found it particularly ironic was I was like, how old is she? 26. I mean, I was there standing there doing the funeral, right? So of course she wasn't too young. Now, maybe it was too difficult or traumatic. Those are different things, but she wasn't too young because her friend had died and she wasn't too young for death. And so because she wasn't too young to have grief, she definitely wasn't too young to be able to engage in the things that would comfort her in her grief and help others in their grief. So I can only begin to even get my brain around how isolated you must have been. I mean, I was 35 and I found it so isolating, and I had a good decade into a bit on you. And people didn't even know what to do with me then with the sister loss. And I talk about that in the book, right? How often it would happen that, it would come up maybe with people I didn't know. Oh, I just lost a sister. And they'd say, your sister, your sister. They were maybe a little bit prepared for a parent or a grandparent.
Right. Yeah.
I'd say, yeah, my sister. And they'd do that, your sister. And it was tough. And so I think it almost scares people. It almost was so upsetting for people that they couldn't quite meet me there, which I suspect. Did you find that as well?
Yes, absolutely. Or, especially in my younger years, when someone's asking, so how many siblings do you have? You getting to know someone new, and they're like, so how many or how many siblings do you have? And, who's your parents? Da, da, da. And I'm like, well, I have 2 sisters in heaven and one still here. And they're like, what? They can't.
And then they say, oh, I'm sorry. For asking, right? And because
sorry for asking,
oh, I'm sorry. And then now I'm at a point where I can say, no, thank you.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting one too, right? That's such a hard one for grievers to remember, that you can still hold on to those pieces of your identity. That was such a hard thing right after my sister died, that question of how many siblings do you have? And there was like 2-3 years where that did feel like a knife in the heart, because I'd think, do I say 2 or do I say 3?
Right.
And you hear parents say that, right? How many children do I have? Do I say 1? Do I say 2? And we need to be like, our identity hasn't changed as that person's sister or parent or grandparent or loved one or a sibling or what have you, because they've died, right? So I'm still one of 4. And I'm still Roxanne's little sister. You're still your sister's little. I didn't get your sister's names. I'm sorry, I'm not remembering.
Oh, you're fine. Sharon and Angie.
So you're Sharon and Angie's little sister still.
Yeah.
And I think it was so important in my healing as I learned to say that without apology, because people still do it, right?
Yeah.
How many from I say, oh, I'm from 4, my eldest sister died. Oh, I'm sorry. It's okay. She's still part of me, and then we move on, right? But learning not to feel like I had to modify my understanding of who I am because of maybe it being a bit awkward when I say it,
right?
And that's okay. So part of grieving is learning that sometimes people are going to be a bit awkward around you.
That's so true. So true. Thank you so much for just engaging during that time of I feel like hearing from you and just how you walk through that process is going to be so powerful for those who are listening.
I wanted
to,
and so the story is so powerful as well.
And so I want to kind of dive like a few more questions into the book, and it kind of flows with what we've been talking about anyway, of course. So
Awesome.
we all need grieving room, and
Oh,
so
yeah.
the chapters in your book, they outline these different types of rooms and grieving rooms that we need. So can you just share some of those with us?
Yeah, the book, I often say it's a mix of memoir, but how to. It's a mix of memoir and kind of self help, for lack of a better term, because it is written to say here are things we need to make space for in grief, and it uses my experience to help explain that. So it begins with my sister's diagnosis through her death, and then up through the years as I processed her death from there. And so there's all different journeys on there. And so as my sister initially, I start with a chapter called Room to Be Uncertain. And I talk about this sense that when she was diagnosed with cancer, that I had to have this very certain amount of faith in order for her to be healed. And that I needed to learn that there was going to be uncertainty in the future and that I wasn't going to have some perfect faith that was going to ensure an outcome in the way I wanted. And talking about that room to be uncertain, that room to not say, God's going to do things exactly this way, or I have enough faith. Because the truth was, I was full of doubt and fear. I go through things like Room for Dying, talking about that at reality, that when someone's dying, we need space for that season, not to just pretend it's not happening right up until the moment they go, or that we're just still willing it away. Of course, some people might want to be just praying for that miracle right till the last minute, of course. But for me, that need to say this unique sacred space between life and death is an era, for lack of a better term,
Yeah, yeah.
that needs room and space, and that I needed space for. And then from there, I talk about things like room for rituals, the importance of making space for those things to allow us to say goodbye. One of the chapters that people almost always bring up is my chapter called Room for Imperfect Goodbyes.
Mm.
When I talk about how our goodbyes with our loved ones almost never look like they do in TV and on movies and in books, and that they're often profoundly complicated, imperfect, nothing like we pictured, and that that's okay. As I talk about grief, I talk about things like room for the roller coaster of grief, room for living in a grief bubble, room for regret. That regret is a normal part of grief. We often feel like having regret is somehow its own sense of loss or failure, but yet regret is a normal part of grief. I regret not phoning them more. I regret that we didn't do things in a different way. I regret that mean thing I said to them when we were 6 years old. There's so many things that we
Mm.
regret. And we make room for that as we grieve and we mourn until I get to things like room for resurrection,
Mm.
and even room to never get over it, in which I talk about not that we don't learn to find a way to have a beautiful life again, but that our grief becomes something that we do carry. And in that sense, our goal isn't to say, what does it look like when it's just behind me? Instead, it's what does it look like to move forward with this thing that we carry, and be new, still beautiful versions of ourselves. So those are just
Mhm.
some examples of the things I talk about
Yes,
for the room.
it's so beautiful, so beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
It's uh, such a work that's needed for those who grieve, and for really for everyone, right? So it's for the griever and for those who are supporting grief.
Yes.
Just to hear and see, put language to, um, yeah, this process. And as you mentioned, it's like it's part memoir and then part how to. It's like, grabbing a book, reading story to say this, yeah, me too, I'm not alone. She went through this. She did, these are the things that, popped up in her and how she became aware, as well as you can do this too. You can make space
Mm,
and have room to grieve in this way. So I love that
mm,
about your book.
thank you.
And so I want to ask this question: as a pastor, what challenges have you found within church settings that kind of keep grievers feeling as if their grief is not welcome?
Yeah, that's actually one of the chapters that I spend some time talking about. I talk about the need to make room for lament. So I think, again, one of the unique realities of being people of faith is is, first of all, that it is a wonderful blessing. And so, to be clear, I am so thankful for the hope of eternity.
Yes.
And when that person said to me, you have to have hope, I said, I do have hope. And I responded with my favorite Bible verse from the book of Romans, which says, if we live to the Lord. And if we die to the Lord. And whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. But I think what we sometimes struggle with in church is the sense that in order to have that hope, it must mean that we also can't be sad and we also can't grieve, where those things can coexist. And we really struggle to let them coexist. And I think it's okay because we see Jesus let those coexist all the time. Jesus said, blessed are those who mourn. We see him weeping at Lazarus's tomb. We see him weeping the night before he's dying. And the Bible is full of lament. There's an entire book in the Bible called Lamentations, which is full of lament, even as it interjects with, in Lamentations 3, and it says, but this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope because of the Lord's great love. We are not consumed. Yeah. His compassions never fail. They're new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. Right in the midst of this huge book that just a few verses before says, you've walled me in and I can't get out and I'm surrounded in darkness. Yeah. And those two things exist together all the time. So my hope in the church is that we can make space for them both to exist. And that when someone says, I'm profoundly sad and I'm profoundly grieving and I'm devastated and I'm even angry at God, that we don't have to say, don't say that. And we don't have to say, oh, but they're in heaven or they're in a better place, or focus on the positive. And so again, one of the chapter I was going to mention is one, Room for Lament. And I think one of the great gifts, if there's any pastors listening to this, is that we can make room for lament in churches. And it doesn't have to be lament always tied up with a pretty bow at the end that it's so, we now have to say, but let's not forget this. Lament can just be, because God makes room for lament. And lament being when we simply name our sorrows. And again, Christians struggle with this. Just this morning, I was scrolling through my Instagram page, catching up on comments. And last week, we're recording this just a few days after Easter for anyone who might listen later. I did a post called Room, I can't remember the exact title, about when Easter hope is complicated. And I wrote saying, if you're grieving and you go to church this Sunday, it's okay to find it a bit hard, right? Because you might hear, death, where's your sting? And it still really stings. And that makes sense. And there were all these comments. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, that's me. I'm not ready to sing yet that's Easter. And I just said, that's okay. Doesn't make you a bad Christian. But wasn't there a comment this morning? If you made this, I'm sorry, I hid it because I just don't allow those comments for our grievers who don't need that. They said, Bibles are free. You should read them. Easter is for hope. Easter is for hope. Right? And I thought, no, right? And again, it was just missing the point. No one's saying we're taking away Easter, and I'm not trying to dismiss whatever this person's grief is, but that's what we do to other Christians. I'd say in the totality of my 3 years running this page, hundreds of posts, 35,000 followers, it's big. I have maybe hid like 3 comments the whole time. And those are the ones I hid, the ones that dismiss others' grief, right? That say you're doing something wrong. And because I just don't think we don't need any more of that guilt and shame. People often say that. I get trolled. Never. Maybe I'm opening myself up here. Some people are very respectful of this page, And again, sometimes grievers disagree. They have different opinions. I'm not saying that. But the things that just say, oh, you're doing it wrong, or that's bad. I'm like, no, we don't need any more of that. But that's what we do. We say hope has to look like this. And we make the false assumption that because we're struggling, because we're angry, because we still carry this grief and loss, that we don't also still have hope and still don't carry the hope of what God has for us. So that's something that I hope we can keep making space for. And what's beautiful is one does not negate the other. And in fact, the more we make space for that grief and that lament, I find the more space it makes for hope. It's like the room to let it out leaves room to let the hope in.
Yes. Oh, that is so powerful. And that is so true. So powerful. I love that. And as we're coming to a close, I think that is like the power of Holy Spirit, thank you. Because it just really brings it all together, what we've been talking about, and it's just it needs to be said and spoken about. So I want you to, which you've given us so many words of hope just in what you said a few minutes ago, but could you leave us with some words of hope for the listeners as we come to a close?
Hope for all of us. There may be different things that bring us hope in different days. And what I generally try to say to grievers, as silly as it sounds in terms of as this hopeful, is you're not broken and you're not crazy. As hard and difficult as it feels, grief is this hard. There's not something wrong with you. There is something wrong. You're grieving. Someone in your life died, and that's wrong and awful. And it feels unnatural because it is. And this is why Jesus came to defeat death, because it is so unnatural and sad. And so those big feelings that you feel don't make you bad or wrong, even if people are trying to somehow sweep them away. And the hope I would give as well, even though it can be hard to believe it, is that it will not feel this horrible forever. My grief counselor, and this is the example I find most helpful, when I met with her one day and I said, is it always going to feel this awful? And she drew this little picture. She drew me as a grief, she drew a little stick person. She said, this is you. And then she said, this is your grief. And she put a big circle around the stick person. And she said, you are in it right now. It's all you see. Every step you take is in your grief. She said, but one day it'll be like this. And she drew the stick person and she drew the circle next to the stick person. And she said, it's not going to disappear. Your grief doesn't go away, but you won't feel like you live right in the center of it all the time. And what I can say to those of you who are grieving is you're going to be in that space for a while. And that space is okay to be in, that you're right in that bubble, that circle. And you won't be in it forever. And so remember that. Even on the days it's hard, let yourself live in it as you need to. You'll go in and out sometimes. And the final thing I would say in terms of what I think can be such an important reminder is you won't forget them. And I think sometimes grievers really fear that. We're going to forget them. Somehow they're going to feel so far from us, and you won't. And I don't know how to promise you, but I do promise you, because they are such a part of who you are and who you've become, that even if you forget a little story here and there or a little detail, they've become so much a part of you. Even if you only had them in your life for a moment, if you lost a baby really young or as a young person or what have you, that they're always going to be such a part of who you are. That's the hope I hope to offer.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this time. I want you to just share with those who are listening how they can connect with you and how they can get your book, Grieving Room.
Absolutely. So again, I mentioned this Instagram page, which is called, it's at grieving.room. So you can follow me there. I share, try about weekly usually, just some thoughts on grief. I try to make them, I realize that a full book when you're newly grieving can be a lot to take in. So sometimes what you can manage is, one screen on Instagram or a little paragraph. And so please follow me there. My website is leannefriesen.com, which has updates about, where I'm going to be doing events and things like that. And then you can get the book really wherever you buy books. It is on Amazon. In Canada, of course, it's Indigo, Kohl's, Chapters, Barnes & Noble in the States. You can also get it from my publisher directly, which is at Broadleaf Books. So most places where books are sold, you should be able to ask for it and find it. I hear it's at Target in the States as well, which I found thrilling because we don't have Target in Canada. And some of you may not know this, but many a Canadian drives across the border just to go to Target. And it's part of our ritual as Canadians to hit Targets in the States. So I was sort of thrilled when I heard the book was at Target. So you can find it too.
All right, so that gives you an excuse to go across the border to Target.
I need to go to Target. I need to drive the bus. It's about an hour from me. Yeah, you're right. It's a good point. That would be a thrill. Next time I'm there, that's my stop.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Leanne, for sitting with me today. I mean, it's been such an honor to hear your story, to hear the heart behind your book, and just the work that you're continuing to do for others who are hurting and affected by grief. So I just so appreciate you. And I know all those that are listening and have heard your words today appreciate you as well.
Thank you for what you're doing as well. It matters so much. And Can You Just Sit With Me is a great reminder when we don't know how to help grievers to think, maybe I should just sit with them. Mm-hmm. So thank you for that beautiful message you're sharing.
Yes, thank you.
It's a pleasure to meet you.
Same here.
That brings me to the end of this episode. Thanks again for joining me, and thanks for listening to Can You Just Sit With Me? If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and be sure to come back for my next episode of Can You Just Sit With Me? Until then, this is Natasha Smith, helping you to find hope in grief, hope in the hard place, and hope in the challenging times of life. Be sure to connect with me across social media, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at I'm Natasha Smith.